Due Process, recipient of 6 Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards.
To prevent terrorism, not to be merely prosecutional.
1 year later, the government says it is making us safer. Civil liberties advocates claim it's making us less free. The war on terrorism here at home, security at the price of civil rights. The experts debate on part 2 of a special 9/11 update up next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual.
It has been a week of memorials and tributes, remembrances and regret. But here at Due Process, where it's our job to monitor justice, our focus has been on the aftermath of the attacks, on legal and social justice post 9/11. So on last week's program, we brought together a distinguished panel to debate the crucial question of whether our civil liberties have suffered in the name of national security. But with so much so important to say on that subject, we had just gotten started when we had to stop. So we're grateful that our guests, experts with very different views, but with all vast experience in theory and practice, agreed to stay with it for a second half hour. You'll hear from them in just a minute. But first, Sandy King last week gave us a long and thoughtful field piece to set up our studio conversation. Let me ask you to watch about 90 seconds from that report, just to bring you up to date on the kinds of questions we're here to talk about.
For Muslims in America after 9/11, the standard seems to be, you're presumed to be guilty until you prove innocence.
Sir, I'm 4 months for immigration in Nigeria here.
At a governmental level, I fear that it's getting worse because day in, day out, almost every other day, you find out that another person's being detained without charge.
Your problem is with INS. I need like 15 minutes because I put in Nigeria here. No anybody listen to me.
Our country was attacked, and I was feeling the same thing what any American family felt. Yet, I had to go one step further to say that I'm innocent of this, or my community is innocent of this. It's like, I'm victim twice. One is a victim as an American, and one as a Muslim.
It's an argument that may not resonate in the wider culture, where some profiling may seem unpreventable.
It's probably a safe bet that in the cornfields of Iowa, cells from Al-Qaeda weren't being fermented.
Where an extraordinary threat may be seen to justify extraordinary measures.
Well, they better do something quick.
I think there's a fine line, and I don't think the federal government nor the County of Passaic in this instance has crossed that line. These are extreme times. I don't think these are extreme measures.
Jan Ting knows all about immigration. He's a former assistant commissioner of the INS, now a professor at Temple University's Beasley School of Law. Frank Askin, a general counsel to the American Civil Liberties Union, is among the country's foremost civil rights advocates and a professor of constitutional law at Rutgers Law School, Newark. And with us in Newark, Andrew McCarthy, a veteran federal prosecutor from New York who has dealt firsthand with terrorism. He led the successful prosecution of the so-called blind sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, and he wants you to know that his opinions are his own and not the government's, and Frank Askin wants you to know that his opinions are not those of the ACLU. And now, Jan, since you're the only guy who's speaking without any caveats at all, let me ask you a question about the young Muslim lawyer who appeared in that report and who says there was a perception among folks that he's representing and talking to that the presumption of innocence, which is at least symbolically maybe lies at the heart of our due process system, doesn't work if you're a Muslim, and presumably he meant of Arab descent or South Asian descent. As a person who cares about the Constitution, but obviously is also in favor of some of the security measures taken, how do you respond to that?
Well, I think there's been a lot of misperception since 9/11. I mean, Muslim and Arab Americans correctly point out that there were no Muslim or Arab Americans among the 9/11 terrorists. Those were all foreigners. And similarly, the targets of the Department of Justice initiatives, including the questioning of the 5,000 recent visitors, the absconder initiative, and all the immigration law violations, arrests, some of which have gone into court, none of those involve any Arab Americans or Muslim Americans. They're all directed towards particular foreign nationals, and that's a perception that I think needs to be understood.
But of course, on the street, the law enforcement person making a stop, if it's not somebody that he knows, may not know the distinction between a person who's an American citizen of, say, Turkish descent, like the story that we've done here at Due Process, or perhaps a person who's an alien.
In general, I think we want our law enforcement personnel to pursue leads, to investigate every area of concern that comes to their attention, but I think we have to draw a distinction between the law enforcement personnel doing that and people doing that on their own. We don't want a bunch of vigilantes roaming around trying to enforce the law on their own, but there is a role for law enforcement here, and it has to pursue the leads and areas of concern.
Then I've got to sneak in a question, since Jan made that point about the TIPS program, the program in which the government is planning, it says, to recruit citizens to give information on other citizens. Some controversy, even Dick Armey, a conservative in the president's party, has his doubts. Frank?
Well, I mean, TIPS has not received a very welcoming reception from the American people. Unfortunately, the Bush administration seems to be backing away from it. I mean, it really is typical, 1984. Everybody is suspect. The Big Brother is watching everything. You don't know who you can talk to, who you can trust. That's not what we want in this country. Look, it's not to minimize the terrible dangers we face. There's no question about that. But are we going to undermine our entire democratic system out of fear of the unknown? That's our problem. Where do we draw a proper line between true concern for national security, but protecting the principles on which this nation was founded? That's very important. We can't abandon all those principles. And TIPS was a terrible idea.
Andrew, if you don't have anything to ask about TIPS, I wanted to ask you another question, but first let me give you a shot at TIPS.
No, I think it's a matter of ebb and flow. At a time when there's high concern about national security, it's an obligation of citizenship. To provide information to national security authorities, to the executive branch.
Will do that.
But let me play on your experience a little bit. Sure. It seems to me that one of the things that really outraged many people when they heard about this was the meter man, the guy coming to read the electric meter, encouraged to look around and give information. Right. What's he going to learn? I mean, people are not likely to be plotting terrorist acts while he's there. Suppose there's a picture on the wall or a saying or something that raises the kinds of First Amendment questions that we'd all be sensitive to. Is that really likely to lead to effective law enforcement or to create another kind of environment? Well,
look, I think that you can pick out bad factual situations, all over the lot. The upshot of all of it, the accumulation of all of it, is that we still live in a very lawful society. Law enforcement is still obligated to conduct itself in a lawful way.
You're right, Andrew, I did give you a bad factual situation. Okay. It was deliberately done. But let me ask you whether, on balance, in that context, for example, whether this is something that advances the ball or is more likely, in terms of legitimate law enforcement objectives, or more likely to have negative impacts in terms of unnecessary fear and probably information to law enforcement that isn't worth an awful lot.
I really don't think so. I think that people should understand and be confident in the fact that the people who are analyzing this information, particularly as it gets filtered through the system, are adept at separating the wheat from the chaff. And the fact that there haven't been as many horror stories as as one might think, it should give some comfort to some people on that.
We're going to come back to your law enforcement background, but while you're here, Jan Ting, I can't not talk about immigration. Certainly at the heart of much of the controversy has been both the policies of the Immigration Service in terms of many of the 1,200 people initially arrested in September were arrested or ultimately deported on the basis of what were minor charges of immigration violations, turning out not to be terrorists, and then the secrecy surrounding which the government wants to hold many of the hearings. Your take on that, and whether it would look the same if you were still.
Let me say a couple of things about that. First of all, it's a common tactic of law enforcement. If you don't have all the evidence against somebody for a serious crime which you believe that person is guilty of, you bring charges for the crime for which you do have the evidence. And I think that's largely what's been going on here. There are individuals whom the government believes were involved in terrorism. They don't have the evidence. All they have is a phone number and a phone book or a contact or a roommate or something like that. But they can prove, they have all the evidence they need to show that that person is in the United States in violation of our immigration laws. And those are the charges that are then brought. It's also important to point out that the Supreme Court for a century has held that immigration law violations do not result in criminal proceedings, that removal from the United States is not a criminal penalty. And because it's a civil proceeding and not a criminal proceeding, a lot of the constitutional protections that we normally associate with criminal proceedings do not apply in immigration proceedings. You're not entitled to a lawyer paid for by the taxpayer. You're not entitled to invoke the exclusionary rule. You're not entitled to a jury trial, even if you want one. So there are important differences in the way that an immigration proceeding is conducted.
People weren't held secretly when you were assistant commissioner, and people weren't arrested in large numbers.
No one is being held secretly. That is an overstatement.
Well, names not being revealed to the public. Frank, you've been involved in litigation.
The government is not presenting a list of names to the media. And the media is involved in this litigation, not the individuals. The individuals are free to go to the media. The lawyers are free to go to the media. The families are free to go to the media if they want to. It's an overstatement to say that the government is withholding names.
May I add 2 things?
You'll get in. I'll come back to you, Andrew. Go ahead. Sure.
Since after 9/11, we had some 1,200 people of Arab descent who were held for periods of up to a year without any hearings, in secret, whether they were, maybe they had access to a telephone at some point out. There's some question of whether they even had access to a telephone. A lot of them say they did not have access to contact anyone. Relatives said they couldn't find out what happened to people. And they're held incommunicado for, this is not the American way. I mean, even, now it's true, most of these people were guilty of some immigration violation, and their rights are thereby limited. But they have a right to a hearing, and if the government has not brought a single charge against any of these 1,200 people, most of them were ultimately deported, but it took 6 months for them to even get out of this country. People who wanted to be deported couldn't even be deported.
Andrew, I'm coming to you, but just let me ask you one thing. We started out, and the Attorney General started this round of detentions by saying these are suspected terrorists. Turns out that notwithstanding your statement about the traditional law enforcement approach, you get them on what you got, these people turned out, it seems, not to be terrorists in terms of effectiveness, or at least maybe you should tell us whether you think they turned out to have terrorist connections.
Well, I don't know that we can say that they weren't terrorists. I mean, in fact, a few of these immigration cases have resulted in charges, criminal charges being brought subsequently. But the fact that the government doesn't have the evidence doesn't mean that they're not terrorists. Al Capone went to prison not for any murder or extortion. He went to prison for underpaying his income taxes. That's what the government.
Let me bring Andrew in. Andrew, and then back to Frank.
I can only add to what Professor Ting said. In connection with the detentions, other than the enemy combatants that we spoke about the last time, there were basically 2 categories: the people who fell into the immigration violation category and the others who were held as material witnesses in connection with grand jury proceedings. A common misconception about that is that they were, incommunicado. Almost uniformly, those people were brought before federal judges. They were represented by counsel.
But Andrew, let me come back to this. I mean, Jan Ting said, and I'm sure he doesn't want this said without qualification, that the fact that the government doesn't have evidence doesn't mean they're a terrorist. But isn't one of the bottom line questions, if we do something that involves a feeling of uncertainty among a sizable portion of the population in the name of fighting terrorism, one question is, does it help us fight terrorism? Is there evidence? Even the government doesn't seem to be saying most of those 1,200 were terrorists or people against whom it has evidence of terrorist involvement.
Right, but we're not talking in this context about, the price of being wrong isn't that a kilo of heroin walks someplace or some small crime gets committed. What we're trying to prevent is, mass homicide. There's an obligation to follow leads. There's an obligation to question people who, in good faith and with colorable reason that was demonstrated to the United States court, were people who might have information that might save lives.
Frank, Andrew says on the one side is mass homicide.
And my God, can you imagine what would have been said if those leads hadn't been followed up, and if those
Andrew,
let
me give Frank a chance to respond.
That's what we did in World War II to the Japanese. We were going to prevent some of them from committing espionage or sabotage, so we kept 120,000 people locked up for 5 years. Now, we haven't reached that point yet, true. But the fact is that it seems that Arab Muslims, well, because there are a handful of them who are terrorists, there's no question about it, but they're all become suspect. This is the height of racial profiling. Right. It seems to me Muslim Arabs in this country are now automatically suspect. They're being held. They might be terrorists, therefore we've got to hold them. Who knows what they're going to do? And that's not the American way. I mean, we're going to totally undermine our entire system of justice and democracy in this country. And I must tell you, I don't think the problem is a lack of intelligence. It's been a lack of analysis, as we've now learned. I mean, there's now a lot of evidence that before 9/11, there was evidence available that maybe could have prevented, I don't know, but at least there was evidence that should have led the intelligence agency in a different direction. It was a failure. And, and that's why I sometimes think that some of what's going on now is a smokescreen to hide the failures of actually uncovering the terrorists. And I want this one quickly.
All right, I do, but Andrew, let me ask you one question that we got to ask you, which is you tried the World Trade Center case in 1993. You've obviously had almost a decade to be aware then of the issue of terrorism. Right. Were there a whole lot of things that the intelligence community and other aspects of government should have been doing between then and last September?
I think that over time, the intelligence community and the law enforcement community has gotten, much better than it was in the early 1990s at coordinating information and getting through it. But part of the problem that you face is precisely what's been demonstrated by Professor Askin. In the space of about 90 seconds. He wants to condemn the government for trying to do what it can do legally to go out and obtain information. And then he wants to talk about intelligence failures. You have to be able to get the information. You have to be able to get it. You have to be able to analyze it.
I just like to quote a sentence quick from the conservative columnist William Safire, who talked about the effort of the Ashcroft Justice Department to increase their surveillance powers. And he says, "Thus we see the seizure of new powers of surveillance is a smokescreen to hide failure to use the old power." And he's talking about the inability of the FBI to have used the information they did have to combat terrorism before 9/11. Right. And I think there's a lot of truth to it. There is no evidence that they didn't have enough powers in the past.
I would point out that in the very case that I was involved in, a massive bombing attack on the lower
That's the Abdul Rahman case.
Yes, a massive attack on the United Nations complex, the Lincoln and Holland tunnels. And the FBI headquarters in Lower Manhattan was protected by effective law enforcement and effective coordination between the FBI and the CIA.
Well, then the question arises, why did something else even worse happen 8.5 years later? But let me ask Jianting whether the nature of the threat is the only factor in determining how far you move into uncharted areas in terms of civil liberties.
Well, it's ironic that civil libertarians do place the government in a kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. You're damned if you carry on a thorough investigation and ask questions, and you're damned for failures, a failure to uncover things. So, they don't want you to investigate, and then they condemn you for not investigating. Frank has several times raised the Japanese internment as a kind of red herring for us. I mean, nothing analogous to the Japanese internment is happening. What was wrong with the Japanese internment was that the overwhelming majority of those in detention were, in fact, United States citizens who were in detention solely on the basis of their race or ethnicity. No one would have objected to those individuals being questioned like German Americans or Italian Americans and being dealt with on a case-by-case basis. If someone is a particular threat, if someone has violated the law, deal with them then.
You're an Asian American. Do you object to being profiled?
Well, it depends what you mean by profiling.
Stopped on the basis of ethnicity alone by law enforcement?
The issues post 9/11 are so complicated and they're so simplified in the way that they're presented by the media that it's difficult for people to get a handle on what's going on here. I mean, the way that these detentions are presented as secret detentions, they're not secret detentions. I mean, the lawyers, the families, the individuals are free to go to the media.
The government's fighting to keep these hearings closed in immigration. Let me let Frank have a quick chance.
We just don't want the media in. We don't want the way in which information is gathered out in the public.
Oh, I don't know if the government has the right to determine that. But Frank, you've been charged with, in a friendly way by Andrew, with wanting to have it both ways. You want to hamstring the government, but on the other hand, you want to complain afterwards that the job isn't being done right.
I want to protect our constitutional liberties, and I want the government to have to demonstrate why it's incompatible, why our constitutional rights are incompatible with national security. I don't think they can make that case. I think there is plenty of power that exists within the governmental intelligence agencies now to combat terrorism without having to do away with due process, without the need for secret evidence, secret hearings, secret detention, secret wiretapping, secret black bag jobs, which are now this new Foreign Intelligence Security Court can authorize. And now, in fact, the government now wants to expand that even further. And when once the government got slapped down by this, in 2,000 cases, the Foreign Intelligence Security Court had never denied a warrant. Government gets slapped down once, and they're screaming.
Andrew, let me give you a quote. People who trade liberty for security wind up with neither. Now I got to tell you that's G. Gordon Liddy. But putting that aside, but maybe keeping it in the center as well. Frank raises the question about what the Intelligence Court, which is a group of 11 judges from around the country who sits to hear applications from the government, which were at least prior to the Patriot Act almost exclusively concerned with intelligence, but now there's a greater possibility that the government can see applications on the basis of a lesser standard than ordinary against targets primarily for criminal reasons, as long as there's an intelligence purpose. The government's attempt to change guidelines led to an opinion in May that really raises the question about the borderline between intelligence functions and criminal evidence gathering. Are you concerned at all about that line, or do you think those are kind of gossamer concerns being raised?
No, I think it's a legitimate concern to watch. I also think that it's got to be watched in an adult way. Part of the, the genesis of this problem is the fact that, prior to the law being amended, and the procedures that were in place at that point, there was an erection of a wall between intelligence and criminal justice, so that in truth the left hand didn't know a lot of times what the right hand was doing, which was very frustrating and almost made it as if if you wanted to be a criminal in this country, you were in trouble. If you wanted to be a terrorist in this country, you ran some risk. But if you wanted to be a criminal who was a terrorist, you had sort of an escape clause in the law.
But I think
the effort that's being made is to try to arm the people who need to protect us with the information that they need.
Can you try to get us to a point? Are you saying, Frank, that anybody who takes aggressive action against terrorism that rubs up against the line is being improper, or are you saying something else? Because this intelligence court is one that had 10,000 opinions that the government had asked for.
Well, the intelligence court itself I think is a threat to civil liberties. It's Foreign Intelligence Security Court. It is a secret court. It operates in total secrecy. It does not operate on probable cause. The government can always get warrants if there's probable cause to believe a crime is underway. They've done away with probable cause. The FISA court itself was an end run around the Fourth Amendment. With the new proposals for the FISA court, they now want to go right through the middle of the Fourth Amendment. They're not going to be an end run anymore. They want to do away with the Fourth Amendment. As long as the government can say there's some connection to terrorism or national security, we don't need probable cause to get warrants anymore. That's the government's position.
Let me ask you a question that is maybe underlying much of the concern. There obviously are two, for lack of a better word, camps in terms of how people see this balance. And maybe there should be more debate, but where there is debate, it is intense. And that may be in part because everyone tells us this is not the beginning of a war that's over in a year or two, but a war that could conceivably outlive all of us who are currently discussing it. Does that raise the stakes on the question of what liberty interests may be either undermined or altered as we move down the road?
I don't think so. One thing about war is you never know how long it's going to last. I mean, a year after Pearl Harbor, we didn't know how long that war was going to last. Whether we were engaged a 100-year war against Japan and Nazi Germany, or whether we were even going to lose that war. I mean, it wasn't clear.
But this one, is it a reasonable prediction that this will go a long time?
Well, I don't know. Was it a reasonable prediction a year after Pearl Harbor that it was going to go a long time? War is by its nature uncertain. We don't know. However, one thing is certain, and that is that we have a way of resolving all of these concerns. We have a way of resolving whether Frank is right about constitutional violations or not. There is due process. There is a system of courts and law. We have precedents in place.
I'll come back.
These questions
Andrew,
will be decided.
A fairly quick answer. Do you think the longevity of the possible war raises the stakes on this debate?
I think it is reason to watch it carefully. I don't think so otherwise.
Frank, let me ask you the same time question. Does the possible length of the war raise the stakes on the debates about security versus civil liberties?
Well, I suppose it does. If, as Andrew says, this is a war and the war is unending and you can do anything you want in the war, the Constitution doesn't matter anymore.
I didn't say you can do anything you want in the war.
Then, you know, it raises the stakes. I mean, I must tell you, the most hopeful sign is that the federal courts, the judiciary, has been standing up to Bush and Ashcroft on these issues.
However long the war is going to take, our time to talk is at an end. So we're going to have to leave it here for now, with thanks to Professor Jan Ting, to Professor Frank Askin, my friend whose name I've forgotten, and to Assistant U.S. Attorney Andrew McCarthy. We're going to be back again with another issue of law and social policy next week, along with Sandy King. So you be sure to stay with us.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual,